Notice the quote that's on the screen. This demonstrates the importance of studying history. He who knows only his own generation remains forever a child. So if you want to become mature, you need to learn about the past, and that's what we're doing in this class. Right now we're going to go into an idea of what the past was, how it began, as we consider two different perspectives of looking at history. There is the secular viewpoint, looking at history through man's theories, and then there's the biblical history, which is looking at history through the Bible. And we pursue the latter of those two unapologetically, because I believe that the Bible is true. It's been demonstrated over and over again that when it relates to history, that it's accurate every time. There have been many times when people thought that there was something inaccurate in what the Bible was saying, and that the historians were right. But over and over again, it's been shown that the Bible actually was right all along, and oftentimes the secular historians were incorrect. So when it comes to a choice between whether I believe what a secular historian says or whether I believe what the Bible clearly says, if it's clear, then I'm going to go with the Bible because it's been right every time, whereas historians are often demonstrated to be incorrect. So let's examine the basic philosophy of the beginning of everything. We have all heard of something called prehistoric times, right? Prehistoric times. And so, we have things like ape-men. Were there really ape-men? Well, what do you think? Were there ape-men? People that were transitions between ape and men? No, there's no evidence for that at all. And yet that's a major belief of secular historians. Without any proof, without any justification, but because it fits into their secular perspective, their anti-biblical perspective. Look at this piece that I took out of an educational magazine. I don't know if you can read it from there. You can if you have good eyes. And it says, talking about the Neanderthal's Necklace, a book that's written by Juan Luis Arzuaga. Supposedly he has written a book which gets us into the minds of the Neanderthals. So he says, we are the same men and women who 25,000 years ago lived under the open sky where large urban centers stand today. We are their descendants, the great-grandchildren of those hunters and gatherers. And then it goes on to talk about the different things that he speculates concerning Neanderthals. Look at the top of the second column. The first few million years of human evolution are summarized from the time in Africa before human beings ventured forth into the world, when the slow development of the human mind and physical structure began. So, we evolved. Our minds, our physique evolved. The next chapter concerns the next development, according to this author. And then the final chapter, the last column there, deals with the period of Neanderthal Cro-Magnon coexistence, which ended with the disappearance of the Neanderthals. And then the last paragraph. Reading this book, we enter the world in which the Neanderthals lived, and their existence is dramatically and authoritatively described by one of the world's great experts. But he believes that man developed his mind, his physique developed, and yet is there any evidence of that? No. What do we find? We find in the record that man appears as man. There are no missing links. There are no intermediary forms leading up to man. That whenever a skeleton is found, it's either a man or it's an ape. There's no in between. And oftentimes there have been hoaxes perpetuated concerning skeletal remains that claim to be some kind of a transition, but they're always found to be false. Most of the time intentionally, but sometimes not. Have you ever heard of the skeleton Lucy? All right, I won't go into that one then. That's one that people look to as being one of our ancestors. But in reality, there are bones taken from several different places, put together. It's obviously an orangutan, and yet they claim that it's one of our ancestors. This is a this is an excerpt from the book. The Neanderthals, on the other hand, were not intellectually like our 2.5-year-olds. Actually, their physiological development was very similar to ours. Huh, their bodies developed very similar to ours. Isn't that a surprise? To begin with, their maturity at birth was similar to that of a modern child. So when they were born, they looked very similar to children today. Huh. Who would have thought, right? Like us, they were born much less developed than our chimpanzees. Because when chimpanzees are born, they're born much more advanced. They're able to do more things than humans. By the age of 2.5, they had gone through essentially the same developmental stages leading to adulthood that we have. Huh. And they continued growing and learning from adults throughout childhood, just like we do. How about that? As adults, they acted consciously and purposefully when they manufactured stone tools, built fires, and buried their dead. So why do they think that they were different? They were like us in so many ways. How are they different? They weren't. In fact, you look at pictures that they show of the development of man. This came out of a book, the science book. The key figures in the story of man's ancestors. 25 million years ago, had ape-like teeth and arms, body and face and hands of a monkey. And then probably went on from all fours to walking on 2 legs. And then this is 750,000 years ago, and 500,000 years ago. Pithecanthropus had a man-like but oversized teeth and a higher brow, larger brain than the earlier hominids. His posture was erect. Now, have they found anything that looks like these? No. They don't even find a skeleton. In fact, Pithecanthropus has now been demonstrated to be a complete hoax. It was based on, I think, a bone or two. And from that, and it's often all they have is a bone or two, maybe a few bones of something. And from that, they not only construct what the rest of the skeleton looked like, but they know what it looked like on the outside too. This is pure fantasy. But it's what you see in most museums, right? You've been to museums and seen the progress of man through the ages. All right. So were there ape-men? No. Never existed. There's no demonstration, no facts to support the idea that there were ape-men. And why am I not surprised? Because the Bible tells us that when God created man, he created him as a man, not as an ape-like creature who could not think, who had to develop his brain in order to be able to reason, had to develop his body to what we have today. There's none of that. What about prehistoric times? We hear that thrown around a lot. Prehistoric times. Is there such a thing as prehistoric times? Well, what does that mean? What does prehistory mean? If something is prehistoric, what does that mean? What? Before history. Right? You knew that, didn't you? Was it such a simple question you didn't want to answer? Prehistoric means before history. What is history?
As far back as we can go, think of.
And how do we know what is in history? In our book, we looked at several different ways in which we can find out history, but what do we have to have in order for us to know what has happened? Just in general, what we have to have?
Just information.
Information, right. Now, Yes.
assumption.
Assumptions based on information.
Yeah.
But in order to be history, there has to be information. So when they're talking about prehistoric, they mean before there's any information. And so this is all based on assumptions before there's any information. They're assuming that these things happen, that these creatures develop. Now I want you to look up at this chart I have on the wall. For those that are watching at home, I have a chart on the wall that comes from a book that I bought at Barnes & Noble, which shows the history of the world from creation on up through, I think it's the 1920s, something like that. It shows the major people, events, groups of people, countries, all the way up through. Now, where does it begin? It begins in creation, with the creation of the universe, and particularly of Adam and Eve. Do we have information about that? Do we have information about the creation of Adam? Yeah, it's in the Bible, right? So, that's information. Is there anything before we have information? No. So there's no such thing as prehistoric. Prehistoric is just a way for them to come up with a bunch of assumptions about the evolution of man. A bunch of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all assumptions. About a period of time which doesn't exist. So they can make up anything they want because that period of time doesn't exist anyway. Prehistoric doesn't exist. We know what happened at the beginning. And that chart, it tells you the major people. It wasn't like there are great gaps of time there either. We know who lived for much of that. Not everybody, obviously, but the major characters, we can follow them on through. So what about cavemen? Were there cavemen? Were there people living in caves? Yeah. Yes. So what's the assumption about cavemen?
That they were like the first people. They were dumb. They didn't really speak English, and
they grunted a lot, right? Carried a club, pulled their women by the hair. One day, one of them dropped some meat into a fire. Took it out. Better. It tastes better that way. So they figured out how to cook meat. Not very bright. Before they evolved into what we have today. All right. I don't know if you remember I actually had this up the last couple of days. I forgot that it was coming on the slide here, but here's caveman. TP man, apartment man, hut man, igloo man, teepee man, castle man, caveman. What? Cavemen were just men and women who lived in caves. That's all. It just tells where they lived. Are there people that live in caves today?
yes.
Oh, there must be cavemen then, right? Oh, they're not Fred Flintstone. You ever see that? People live in caves. People have always lived in caves. Why? Because it was convenient sometimes? In fact, there's some evidence to show that in France, where they have found drawings in caves, and we're just astounded at the drawings of animals and stuff that's in there, that and in many places, the people who were living in caves actually might have been kicked out of the village that they were in, which was living in structures, either tents or huts. So maybe they seem more primitive in some ways because they had been forced to live there, away from everybody else. All right, another thing that we hear about prehistoric times are all about the ice ages. How many have heard that there were a bunch of several ice ages lasting thousands of years? We've all heard about that stuff, right? Well, again, the evidence is not there to support that. The evidence really seems to support the idea that after the flood, there was one ice age, a time when ice did cover a large part of the earth. And so what the scientists want to portray as being millions of years, ice age. Actually, when you draw it all down, it's hundreds of years of ice and not so much age. Here's a picture of the globe showing the effects of the ice, where the ice sheets went. And you can see that they did come down across North America, just like we're told, and into Europe. And there was some, here are the Alps, the Pyrenees Mountains. So there was ice here in these mountains. Here's the Andes Mountains in South America. So higher elevations did have ice, and ice sheets did come down as a result of the flood. There were certain factors in how the Earth was cooling and everything that caused that, which I won't go into all the detail. If you want to find out details about that, I would suggest going to the Answers in Genesis website or the Institute for Creation Research, ICR, and they have articles there that will give you much more information and sometimes very technical information about what actually occurred. But there were not millions of years of ice ages, but one ice age that lasted maybe a couple hundred years. So those are some of the myths. Oh, by the way, when was the first ice age? That may have been it. And they've been happening ever since. Okay, we go on with prehistoric times, some other assumptions, and that's about the dinosaurs lived in prehistoric times, right? Not at the same time as man, but what does the evidence indicate? Well, we watched a video yesterday that had a lot of evidence, didn't it? About dinosaurs not only in historical past, but pretty recent history. There have been dinosaur sightings, called dragons, and we've seen them over and over again. And they're even mentioned in the Bible. Some of you are probably aware of this, that in the book of Job, it describes a couple of dinosaurs. Now, a lot of people don't believe it. They come up with other things, but notice what it says in Job 40. It says, God says to Job, behold, behemoth. And then he describes him. His strength is in his loins. His force is in the navel of his belly. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together. All right, that's what you read. But what's the footnote in a lot of Bibles say? Oh, it was probably an elephant or a hippopotamus. Tail like a cedar? You ever seen a tail like that on an elephant or hippopotamus? No. But that description does look a lot like that, doesn't it? That was a creature that was around at the time of Job. And then later on in Job, it discusses Leviathan. And if you read the description of Leviathan, it sounds like what we would call a plesiosaur, which was mentioned in the video we saw yesterday as well, which would be, if you're familiar with the Loch Ness Monster, that's a plesiosaur. And I think there really is one there, or at least there used to be. And there are indications around the world. In addition to what we saw, maybe some of this is duplicated of the video we saw yesterday, but here's some other indications of dinosaurs being alive at the same time as men. This is in a Cambodian temple, and notice the dinosaurs. Look at that. Do you recognize that? What is that?
Stegosaurus.
A Stegosaurus, yeah. I mean, can that be anything else? No. And this is a little harder to make out, but that's obviously a dinosaur. Here's a close-up of the Stegosaurus, and I'm not sure what it is going around there. That might be some kind of reptile creature too, or maybe it's a snake. But how did they know what a Stegosaurus looked like in order to put it on their temple? Even if they found the bones, they wouldn't know what it looked like, for sure. There it is. I think this was covered in the video. These different figures in Mexico that have been found that look just like dinosaurs, made by natives in Mexico. This is in an ancient tomb in Peru. And see these figures? Doesn't look like a camel. Those are some kind of dinosaur. And they have camels there anyway. Here is more from the ancient tomb. Notice the head here and the long tongue, the long neck, spikes on the back. Did they just make this stuff up? I must have seen it. More from Peru. Again, there must have been stegosauri around in Mexico and Peru. Look at this one. What's that look like? Go ahead, say it out.
T-Rex.
Yeah, Tyrannosaurus Rex. Oh, and that was, and there's was that the allosaur?
That's an
Oh, that's an allosaur, yeah, not the Tyrannosaurus Rex would have shorter arms. And here's a Diplodocus with a man. It's like he's either trying to chop it in the head or doing dental work. I'm not sure. But obviously, these guys have seen dinosaurs. Now this is in National Bridges National Monument, and it's kind of hard to see. But there's a man and a dinosaur here. It's hard for me to see from my angle. Can you see it there? Yes, can you see it?
Yep. There's like a little outline of the head that starts it.
And this is Yaru, as described by tribal aboriginals. And I think that would be in Australia. Had features much like a plesiosaur. The above drawing by traditional artists was produced from descriptions. Neither he nor the storytellers knew of plesiosaurs or what they looked like. So they had no preconceived idea that that's what they saw. This is from a tomb in a cathedral that I toured this summer, but they didn't show us this because they never show it to anybody because they've got a carpet over this guy, the bishop's tomb, and you can't see this. I saw someone on a video talking about seeing it, and apparently they pulled back the carpet for him to look at it, and the curator of the cathedral insisted that these were not dinosaurs. I mean, he volunteered that information. He didn't know that the person looking was actually looking to see what they look like, if they look like dinosaurs. He volunteered the information. These are not dinosaurs. Why would he do that? Because almost anybody who looks at it says, those look like dinosaurs. So he wanted to point out that they couldn't be dinosaurs. And they look like sauropods with their necks entangled. So dinosaurs, dragons are not fanciful fairy tale type creatures. They actually existed, and they may even continue to exist in some parts of the world today. Here's a page that shows different places where there's evidence of dragons and dinosaurs. Some of these you're not familiar with, like Mayandi, Yinglong. This is Sumeria, Egypt, Chinese. That's Australian, India, Greek, African, Japanese, Wales, Slavic. Notice all these places where there is evidence of dragons or dinosaurs living. So, we have a choice. We look at history from a biblical perspective or from a secular perspective. Well, the choice is this. If you've got Adam in your past, God created you, then God sets the rules which are absolutes from God. There are rules that God says, here's how you need to live. If you have an ape in your past, then man sets the rules, which is relative morality. You do what you want. And that's one of the key reasons why people will not accept the facts when it points to Adam rather than an ape. Ken Ham has done a great job of putting together what he calls the 7 C's of history. which is an outline of the history of the world through the use of words that begin with C. Of course, it begins with creation, and then corruption. Well, what is corruption talking about? The fall, right. I need everybody, when you answer something, speak up loudly, because remember, we're recording. We want them at home to be able to hear your nice melodic voices as a change from listening to me all the time. So if you give an answer, I won't have to say it again. What's the catastrophe? Right. What's confusion? Right. And then we have Christ coming. And as a part of his coming, then, he endured the cross, paid the penalty for sin, and then ultimately at the end is the consummation when all things are brought together under Christ. So these are the 7 C's. And those would be a good thing for us to remember. How many of you have seen the 7 C's before? Okay, a couple of you maybe at the museum itself. All right, now let's consider something about the early history of mankind. I couldn't get the whole chart on one slide, so this is the beginning. Not actually quite the beginning. This is Adam's life, okay? It starts back here somewhere. So there's Adam. All right, remember he has a son named Seth to replace Abel. And he has a son named Enos. And so that's the 3rd century BC, 2nd century, I'm sorry, the 3rd century of the world. This is the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century of the world, and those are the approximate years. All right, now remember this is Adam. Okay, got that color in your heads? So Adam continues on, 6th century, 7th century, and so does Seth, Enos. All these guys are continuing on. Then we have the birth of Enoch. Do you remember Enoch? What does the Bible say about Enoch? Enoch. There's a very short statement about him, his relationship with God. He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So he apparently just kept walking one day with God, and God said, come on to my house. And so he just went to heaven to be with God without dying. Methuselah, what do you know about him? Yeah, you know? Methuselah was the oldest man in the Bible. Do you remember how old anyway?
990 something.
900. I was thinking 69, but I may be off on that. All right, but I want you to notice something. Who's still alive when Methuselah was born? Adam. And we continue. Here's Methuselah. Adam finally dies after 900 and some years. And just, what, 100 years later, a little more 100 years later, Noah was born. So Noah could have talked to people who knew Adam. Isn't that something? You ever think about that? Even though it was almost 1,000 years since creation, Noah could have talked to people who talked to Adam. What an amazing thing. And then we keep going. These guys finally die. And we've got Methuselah and Noah continuing on. And if we went on further, we would see when Methuselah died, and that's when the flood came. Okay, one of the things that people often ask about the beginnings of man is, where is the Garden of Eden? You ever wondered that? Mm-hmm. All right, I have an answer for you. I don't know. And no one really knows for sure. The only indications we have is that 2 of the rivers cited as that's flowing out of the Garden of Eden are names of 2 rivers we have today. Now the problem is, in between the Garden of Eden and today, we had something catastrophic called the worldwide flood. And it's doubtful to think that rivers would have been in exactly the same place that they were before. It is possible, and so maybe those rivers were called the same name. I tend to think maybe that that people would name those rivers the same names that had been there before. Maybe Noah, maybe his sons named it after the rivers that they knew of that flowed out of the Garden of Eden, maybe hoping that this would be a Garden of Eden too. I don't know. But people speculate that because of where the Tigris and Euphrates River is today and were in ancient times, that possibly the Garden of Eden was down here towards the Persian Gulf. That the land of Eden may have been this whole area because the Persian Gulf has taken over more and more of the land as time went on. So there's speculation about that, but I'm not sure that anybody knows or really can know for sure where the Garden of Eden was, because the flood destroyed it all anyway. All right, next time we're going to look at some of the events leading up to the flood, and an area of controversy concerning people, I should say people, concerning beings called the sons of God. Who were they and what did they do? There's lots of controversy over that, and we'll find out what Mr. Henry's answer is tomorrow.